A soldier does not die quickly here. In a firefight, a bullet travels at 2,000 feet per second. The end is often faster than the nervous system can register. The mud is different. It is a slow, intimate process. It begins with a single misstep. A duckboard, those narrow wooden slats bridging the abyss, shifts under the weight of a marching column. A boot slips. The soldier's foot breaks the surface tension of the sludge. Immediately the clay acts as a seal. The air is pushed out, creating a vacuum around the leather boot. He sinks to his ankle, then his calf. His natural reaction is to struggle, to thrash. This is the wrong instinct. The agitation liquefies the soil further, reducing friction and allowing him to slide deeper. By the time he realizes the danger, he is waist deep. We know exactly what this looked like because the men who survived it wrote it down with terrifying clarity. A diary entry from Private J.W. Palmer of the Canadian Corps describes a comrade slipping off the track in the dark. Palmer writes that the man did not scream at first, he simply looked surprised. The section halted. They extended rifle butts, shovel handles, anything to bridge the gap. But here, physics becomes the enemy. The suction force generated by deep, viscous mud can exceed 100 pounds of pressure per square inch. To pull a man straight up out of that grip requires a force greater than the tensile strength of the human hip joint. Medical reports from the casualty clearing stations document cases of dislocated joints and torn ligaments, injuries sustained not by shellfire, but by the frantic, failed attempts of friends to pull a drowning man free. The equipment they carried sealed their fate. A British infantryman in 1917 carried the standard infantry fighting order: ammunition pouches, entrenching tool, haversack, water bottle, gas mask, steel helmet and rifle. Total weight, nearly 65 pounds. When dry, it was a burden. When wet, the woolen webbing absorbed water like a sponge, adding another 15 pounds of dead weight. This acted as an anchor. Quartermaster returns from War Office file WO95/388 often list kits marked as unrecoverable alongside the names of the missing. The weight dragged them down and the mud held them fast. The true horror, however, was not the physics, but the duration. A man shot through the heart is gone. A man trapped in the mud is still there. He is conscious. He can speak. He can beg. Diaries from the Manchester Regiment describe men trapped in shell holes that had filled with this liquid clay. They would remain there for hours, sometimes days, sinking incrementally. As the level rose to their chest, the pressure began to restrict the expansion of their lungs. They would not drown in the conventional sense. They would suffocate while their heads were still above the surface, the weight of the earth crushing the breath out of them. Witnesses speak of the swimming motion. As the panic set in, trapped men would claw at the surface of the slime, their movements resembling a swimmer treading water. It was a futile expenditure of energy that only accelerated their descent. The men on the duckboards, just feet away, had to make a calculus that haunts descendants to this day. To step off the wood to help was to join the victim. So they watched. They smoked cigarettes to mask the smell. They talked to the sinking man, promised him help that wasn't coming, until the mud reached his chin. Then, silence. This specific form of death created a unique category of casualty. In the official paperwork, these men were listed as missing. There was no body to bury because the battlefield itself was the grave. The earth did not just kill them, it consumed them. It swallowed their dog tags, their paybooks, and their faces. When the sector eventually dried out in the spring of 1918, the ground hardened like concrete, encasing the dead in a geological stratum of war. Modern archaeology confirms what the diaries claimed. Excavations near Boesinger have revealed bodies not lying flat, but vertical, standing upright in the clay, preserved in their final moment of struggle. Their boots are still laced tight. Their fingers are often curled, suggesting they were gripping something. a rifle butt, a strap, a hand, when the end finally came. They are the sentinels of the subsoil, keeping a watch that has lasted more than a century. But the mud was a passive killer. It required a mistake. It required a slip, a fall, a moment of bad luck. For the soldier who kept his footing, who stayed on the duckboard and made it to the trench, there were other forces waiting, forces that did not rely on gravity or suction, but on chemistry and velocity. The mud took the body and hid it. The next threat would ensure that there was no body left to hide. He thought the liquid earth was the worst way to die. He was wrong. Witnesses did not describe an explosion in the conventional sense. They described the earth liquefying. A column of chalk, soil, concrete, and human biology rose 4,000 feet into the air. It hung there, a solid pillar of white debris against the summer sky, before collapsing back into a crater 300 feet wide and 70 feet deep. The men of the German 110th Reserve Infantry Regiment, who had been manning that sector, were not found dead in the aftermath. They were not found at all. They had been converted, in a fraction of a second, from biological entities into a fine particulate mist. This phenomenon requires us to step away from the poetry of loss and look at the cold physics of high-yield detonation. The human body is a resilient structure, capable of withstanding significant trauma, but it has a breaking point defined by physics. That point is reached when the overpressure of a blast wave exceeds the structural integrity of bone and tissue. A pressure of 100 pounds per square inch is usually fatal, causing the lungs to rupture. The center of the Lochnagar mine detonation generated pressures calculated in the hundreds of thousands of pounds per square inch. When a human being is that close to the epicenter of such a release of energy, the speed of the shockwave travels faster than the speed of sound, approximately 8,000 meters per second. The nervous system, by contrast, transmits pain signals at roughly 100 meters per second. This means the brain is physically destroyed before it can register the flash of light. It is a death that occurs in the absolute absence of time. The archives confirm this erasure with bureaucratic indifference. Regimental diaries from the Tyneside Irish, who advanced near the crater shortly after, note the eerie absence of enemy corpses in the immediate blast radius. Instead, they found only fragments: a boot with a foot inside, fused to a piece of duckboard, a twisted rifle barrel, a belt buckle. War Office records from file WO 95/489, the diary of the 179th Tunnelling Company, detail the immense technical effort required to place the mines, but the entries regarding the aftermath are sparse. They speak of successful blow and good crater formation. The human cost is implied only by the void where the enemy used to be. For the families back home, this created a specific kind of torture. There was no body to wash, no uniform to return, no grave to visit. The Quartermaster General's returns for units caught in similar heavy barrages often show a chilling discrepancy between rations issued and kits recovered. In ordinary combat, a dead soldier's equipment, his pack, his rifle, his webbing, is salvaged. In cases of direct artillery hits or mine detonations, the manifest simply lists destroyed. The man and his material possessions were treated as a single inventory loss. There is a psychological component to this that permeates the memoirs of survivors. Soldiers often wrote about the clean death. To be vaporized was, in a dark, twisted logic, preferable to the slow agony of a gut wound or the terror of drowning in the mud. There was a strange envy directed at the men who simply ceased to exist. However, this envy was often a mask for a deeper, existential dread. The fear was not just of dying, but of being deleted, of leaving no trace that you had ever walked the earth. Ballistic analysis of the period suggests that the heat generated at the core of these large-caliber explosions could exceed 3,000 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, organic matter does not burn. It carbonizes instantly. The water in the body flashes to steam, expanding violently and tearing the cellular structure apart from the inside. This is why, in the periphery of the blast zones, soldiers reported finding scarecrows, bodies that looked intact but collapsed into ash when touched. The structural integrity was gone, held together only by the weave of a charred uniform. This total destruction of the body poses a problem for historians and statisticians. Casualty figures for the Great War are often rounded to the nearest 1,000. Part of this imprecision is due to the sheer chaos of record-keeping, but a significant portion is due to the physical impossibility of counting the dead. You cannot count what is not there. We rely on roll calls taken before the battle and roll calls taken after. The difference is the casualty list. But within that list, there is a subcategory of men who vanished into the air, their atoms scattered across the fields of France, becoming part of the atmosphere that their comrades breathed. The sky had become a killer, raining down steel and fire that could erase a man in a heartbeat. The surface of the earth had become a trap, a liquid grave that swallowed the living. But for the men of the tunneling companies, the threat was not above or below, it was all around them. They were fighting a war where the enemy was not a soldier in a field grey uniform, but the earth itself, closing in from all sides. The open air offered the threat of vaporization, but the dark, cramped galleries offered a death that was slow, silent, and completely invisible. The men of the Royal Engineer Tunnelling Companies fought a war that existed entirely separate from the trenches above. Down here, there was no sky, no weather, and no retreat. The tunnels were often less than 4 feet high, forcing men to work on their knees or backs in a slurry of chalk and water. They used a technique known as clay kicking, bracing their backs against a wooden cross frame and using their legs to silently pry the clay loose with a spade. It was a method imported from the Manchester sewer systems, designed for silence. But silence was a weapon used by both sides. When the enemy was detected within range, the response was not a rifle volley, but a camouflage. This is a specific term found repeatedly in the technical manuals of the Royal Engineers from 1916. Unlike a mine, which is designed to breach the surface and destroy trenches, a camouflage is a contained, undercharged explosion. Its purpose is to crush the enemy's tunnel without breaking the surface of the ground. It expands the earth like a balloon, compressing the surrounding clay into a rock-hard vice. War diaries from the 179th Tunnelling Company, preserved in National Archives file WO 95/489, described the aftermath of a German camouflage. The explosion itself might not kill the miners instantly. Instead, it collapses the gallery behind them, sealing them in a tomb of timber and earth. But the concussion is often the lesser of two evils. The chemical byproduct of the explosion is the true killer. When high explosives like ammonal or gun cotton detonate in a confined space with limited oxygen, the combustion is incomplete. This produces massive quantities of carbon monoxide. The miners called it bad air or the afterdamp. It is colourless, odourless, and tasteless. A man can breathe it without realising he is dying until his legs simply refuse to support him. The gas binds to the hemoglobin in the blood 200 times more effectively than oxygen, slowly suffocating the brain while the lungs continue to pump. To combat this, the tunnellers relied on sentinel animals. Canaries and white mice have metabolisms roughly 15 times faster than a human. If the canary on the floor of the gallery stopped singing and fell off its perch, the men had perhaps a minute to retreat before the gas overcame them. However, in the panic of a tunnel collapse, retreat was often impossible. The horror of this subterranean warfare is confirmed by modern archaeology. In 1998, an excavation team discovered a collapsed dugout near Ypres, known as the Vampire Dugout. Inside, they found the remains of soldiers who had been sealed in by a shell blast. They were not mangled. They were sitting or lying in resting positions. The lack of ballistic trauma on the bones indicates they did not die violently. They simply fell asleep as the oxygen ran out, preserved in the dark for 80 years. This war was intimate. On the surface, an artilleryman fired at coordinates, He never saw the men he killed. Underground, the proximity was terrifying. Listeners recorded in their logs that they could sometimes hear the enemy talking, coughing, or singing. They were separated by perhaps 5 feet of clay. A diary entry from a sapper in the Australian Electrical Mechanical Mining and Boring Company describes hearing a German soldier humming a tune just before the order came to blow the charge. You were not killing a target. You were killing a man you could hear breathing. The rescue attempts were often as deadly as the initial collapse. Tunnelers were equipped with proto-breathing apparatus, primitive rebreathers that used caustic soda to scrub carbon dioxide. But these sets were heavy, hot, and prone to failure. Records from the Inspector of Mines show that many would-be rescuers succumbed to the carbon monoxide pockets lingering in the low points of the tunnels. They would crawl into the dark to find their friends, remove their face masks to shout a hello, and drop dead instantly. For those who died down there was no recovery. The galleries were simply backfilled or abandoned. They remain there today, thousands of men encased in the clay, holding their spades, wearing their boots, forever waiting for the order to dig. They died in the absolute dark, in a silence so profound it was deafening. But while the tunnelers vanished into the hidden depths, thousands of infantrymen were rotting in the most visible place on Earth, observed by hundreds of eyes, but unreachable by any human hand. This was the geometry of no man's land. It was a space defined not by geography, but by mathematics. The distance between the opposing trenches ranged from as little as 15 yards at Hooger to several hundred yards elsewhere. But within that strip of ground, the laws of survival were absolute. The concept of a kill zone was not a metaphor, it was a calculation. German machine gunners operating the MG-08 did not fire randomly. They used interlocking fields of fire, a tactical setup where 2 guns were positioned to create a crosshatch pattern of bullets at knee height. To step into that zone during daylight was a statistical certainty of death. We see the cold logic of this in the sniper's logs recovered from the war archives. A German sniper's notebook captured in 1916 details a practice known as baiting. A soldier is shot in the leg or gut, left screaming in the open. The sniper does not finish him off. He waits. He waits for the stretcher bearers. He waits for a friend to lose his nerve and crawl out. The log records the second hit and the third hit with the dispassionate efficiency of an accountant. This turned compassion into a lethal weakness. The presence of the unrecovered dead created a unique psychological torture for the living. Chaplain diaries from the Somme sector speak of the spiritual agony of watching men die over the course of days, unable to offer even the comfort of water or prayer. One entry from a padre in the 51st Highland Division describes a wounded man caught on the wire who screamed for his mother for 2 nights. On the 3rd night, he went silent. The regiment had to listen to his slow death, hour by hour, separated by a distance they could sprint in 6 seconds during peacetime, but which was now an infinite chasm. This torture was compounded by the physical reality of decomposition. In the summer months, a body left in the open transforms rapidly. First, the bloating, as internal bacteria produce gas. Then, the collapse, as the soft tissues liquefy. Finally, the desiccation. But nature was rarely left to do its work alone. The rat population in the trenches exploded. These were not ordinary rodents. Soldiers described brown rats the size of cats, gorged on high-protein diets of human flesh. They would scuttle into no man's land at dusk to feed on the eyes and livers of the unburied. Letters from the Red Cross Inquiries Bureau reveal the administrative horror that followed. Families would write, begging for confirmation. Was he buried? Did he suffer? The officers answering these letters faced a terrible dilemma. They knew the man was rotting 50 yards away, dissolving into the mud, his identity disc still in his pocket, but unretrievable. Yet, they could not write that. So they wrote the standard lie. He was buried with dignity behind the lines. The official status, missing, became a euphemism for unreachable. As the war dragged on, the soldiers underwent a process of desensitization that is frightening to read about. In 1915, a corpse was a tragedy. By 1917, it was engineering material. Memoirs from the Royal Engineers describe using stacked bodies to shore up collapsing trench walls during heavy rain. The dead became sandbags. They became stepping stones in the flooded craters. A soldier from the Lancashire Fusiliers recounted stepping on a stomach that gave way with a hiss of escaping gas, and his primary emotion was not horror, but annoyance that he had muddied his boot. The static nature of the war meant that the same ground was churned over repeatedly. A body left in no man's land in July might be buried by a shell explosion in August, then disinterred by another shell in September. This constant churning destroyed the integrity of the remains. It shredded uniforms and pulverized bone. By the time a recovery party could finally move safely across that ground, perhaps months later, there was often nothing left to recover but fragments. However, sometimes the retrieval was attempted. Trench raids were launched at night, not to capture ground, but to capture identification. A raid might cost 3 lives to bring back 1 identity disc. The mathematics of exchange were brutal. Is a dead man's name worth 3 living men's breath? The commanders often decided it was not, and so the bodies stayed. They became part of the terrain, marked on maps not as graves, but as obstacles or landmarks. Turn left at the dead Frenchman was a genuine navigational instruction. The scarecrow on the wire eventually disappeared, not because he was retrieved, but because he fell apart. His uniform rotted, his ligaments failed, and his bones dropped into the long grass below. He ceased to be a landmark and became part of the soil chemistry. But while the physical evidence of the dead was slowly erased by the elements, a new problem was emerging. When the war finally moved, and the ground was reclaimed, the graves registration units faced a challenge that no amount of bravery could solve. They found thousands of bodies, but they could not tell you who they were. The mud had stripped them of their names, leaving only the silent, terrifying question of identity. This moment of disintegration was not an accident. It was a catastrophic failure of materials science that erased the identities of tens of thousands of men. In the early years of the war, British soldiers wore aluminum or zinc identity discs. These metals were durable. They survived fire, water, and time. But by 1916, metal was a strategic resource needed for shell casings and aircraft parts. Consequently, General Routine Order No. 1911 authorized a change. The Army switched to discs made of compressed vulcanized asbestos fiber. There were 2 tags, a green octagonal one to remain with the body, and a red round one to be removed for administrative recording. The theory was sound. The fiber was heat-resistant and cheap, but the War Office had not tested these tags against the specific chemical environment of a decomposing human body submerged in acidic Flanders mud for 2 years. Under those conditions, the fiber did not just degrade, it dissolved. Graves registration reports from 1920 frequently note discs present but illegible, or discs disintegrated. The very object designed to ensure a man was remembered became the reason he was forgotten. The second line of defense against anonymity was the Active Service Paybook, Army Form AB 64. Every soldier carried one in his breast pocket. It contained his name, his next of kin, his will, and his payment record. It was a paper document. When a man fell into a water-filled shell hole or lay out in the rain for weeks, the water soaked through the tunic and into the pocket. The ink ran. The pages fused together into a solid block of pulp. Forensic archivists today can sometimes use spectral imaging to read these ghostly texts, but in 1919, a wet paybook meant a dead end. Even if the disc and the book survived, the body itself was often stripped of its identity before the burial parties ever arrived. This was the result of a brutal pragmatism known as scavenging. A good pair of boots was worth a fortune. a leather jerkin was vital against the cold. During the war, surviving soldiers would strip the dead of useful kit. After the armistice, returning civilians, desperate and destitute, picked over the battlefields. By the time the official exhumation teams arrived, they often found skeletons that were barefoot and naked. Without the regimental buttons, the cap badge, or the specific stitching of a tunic, a skeleton is biologically anonymous. It is just a collection of 206 bones. We see the scale of this erasure in the archives of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. In cemetery after cemetery, the ratio of identified to unidentified graves is staggering. In some sectors of the Somme, over 50% of the recovered bodies are marked with headstones that read simply, "A soldier of the Great War." Beneath that stone lies a man who had a mother, a wife, a favourite song, and a fear of spiders. Now, he is a statistic. This erasure created a specific psychological pathology among the families left behind. If a man is missing, he is not necessarily dead. This ambiguity fueled a desperate, toxic hope. In the 1920s, newspapers were filled with stories of shell-shocked wanderers, men who had lost their memories and were living in asylums, unaware of who they were. Families clung to these stories. They believed their husband or son was not the unknown soldier in the grave, but the amnesiac in the hospital. It was a fantasy that delayed grief for decades, preventing closure. Forensic science in 1919 was primitive. There was no DNA testing. There were no dental records comparable to modern standards. Identification relied on the balance of probability. If a body was found in a trench map grid assigned to the Black Watch, and the buttons on the tunic were Scottish, and the boots were the right size, an officer might sign off on an identity. But often, the evidence was contradictory. A body might be wearing a tunic from one regiment and boots from another, scavenged during life. Or the remains might be commingled, parts of 3 different men blown into the same crater. The officers of the graves registration units were forced to make impossible decisions. To name a body was to give peace to a family. To name it wrongly was a desecration. The files from the Director of Graves Registration and Inquiries are filled with correspondence from officers agonizing over these choices. They developed a forensic eye for the smallest details, a specific type of tobacco pipe, a customized knife handle, a ring with initials scratched inside. These tiny personal artifacts became the only link between a corpse and a name. But for hundreds of thousands, there was no ring, no book, and no disc. The mud had taken everything. The soldier had not only lost his life, he had lost his history. As the 1920s dawned, the British Empire faced a logistical nightmare. They had millions of dead, scattered across hundreds of miles of farmland, that needed to be returned to the plough. They could not leave them where they lay. They needed to gather them, sort them, and bury them. The chaos of the battlefield had to be replaced by the order of the cemetery, even if the men inside the coffins had no names. The silence of the dead was about to be broken by the sound of industrial excavation. The logistics of this operation were staggering. The British Army divided the devastation into grid squares, each measuring 500 yards by 500 yards. A platoon of men would line up at the edge of a square, shoulder to shoulder, armed not with rifles, but with long iron rods and wooden stakes. They walked slowly. Every few feet, they drove the iron rods into the soil. They were dowsing for the dead. Veterans of these units described a tactile language of the underworld. If the rod struck something hard and metallic, it was a shell casing or a helmet. If it struck something yielding and fibrous, like a tree root, it absorbed the shock. But if it struck something that gave a dull, soft resistance, a sensation described by one labourer as thumping a wet sack, they knew they had found a man. This work was driven by a cold economic reality. War Office financial records from 1919 indicate that for many civilian labourers and Chinese workers attached to the British Army, the pay was supplemented by a body bounty. A small sum, often just a few francs, paid for every set of remains located and recovered. This commodified the dead. It turned the retrieval of a human being into a piecework factory job. Diaries from the Chinese Labor Corps, preserved in the archives, recount the competition between teams to find the most densely populated shell holes, turning mass graves into gold mines. When a body was found, the reality of recovery was often gruesome. After years in the wet earth, the remains were rarely intact. The exhumation companies were issued with canvas sheets and disinfectant, usually cresol or quicklime, to manage the smell. The stench was sweet, cloying, and pervasive. It clung to the hair and clothes of the workers, making them pariahs in the local French estaminets. To move a body that has been decomposing for 3 years is not a matter of lifting, it is a matter of containment. The flesh has often turned to adipocere, a waxy soap-like substance that holds the bones together loosely. If handled roughly, the soldier would simply come apart. The mandate of the Imperial War Graves Commission was to concentrate the dead. This meant digging up the thousands of isolated graves, hastily dug by comrades during lulls in fighting, and moving them to the large permanent cemeteries we see today. This process of exhumation and reinterment was fraught with psychological horror. Workers had to break the bones of the dead to fit them into the smaller transport boxes, a sound that haunted many for the rest of their lives. A report from a chaplain overseeing a concentration unit near Arras noted the moral degradation of the men, who after handling hundreds of corpses a week, became immune to the sanctity of the human form. They stopped seeing men. They saw inventory. The danger was not just psychological. The ground was still live. The soil was packed with unexploded ordnance, the duds of 1,000,000 artillery barrages. A shovel striking a rusted fuse could, and frequently did, vaporize the recovery team. Medical records from 1920 show a steady stream of casualties among the cleanup crews, men killed by the war years after the armistice was signed. They were the final combat deaths of the conflict, dying to tidy up the mess left by their predecessors. Central to this effort were the men of the Chinese Labor Corps. Recruited from northern China, these men performed the hardest, most dangerous labor of the clearance. They dug the pits, moved the shells, and handled the bodies. Their contribution is often relegated to the footnotes of history, but without their backs and their hands, the pristine rows of white headstones that define the Western Front today would not exist. They lived in segregated camps, often treated with suspicion by the locals and indifference by the military command, yet they were the custodians of the empire's fallen. By 1921, the visible scars of the war were beginning to fade. The trenches were being filled in by returning farmers. The barbed wire was rusted and rolled away. The exhumation companies had processed hundreds of thousands of remains, turning chaos into the geometric order of the war cemeteries. They believed the job was done. They believed they had cleaned the slate. But the earth is a dynamic system. It moves, it heaves, and it remembers. The official clearance ended and the armies went home, but the farmers stayed, and every winter as the frost set in, the ground would expand and contract, pushing objects from the deep clay toward the surface. The cleanup was an illusion. The war was not gone, it was merely sleeping beneath the plough line. The soldiers who had been missed by the iron probes in 1919 were waiting for their turn to rise. The iron harvest was about to begin.